Hey guys, good to see you. Well, today I want to emphasize the importance of shooting using manual exposure on your DJI Spark. And as always, if you don't have a Spark, that's okay. Most of these techniques and these basic principles are going to work with any drone. And I'm going to do things a little bit differently today, and I'm going to shoot the rest of this video on my Spark. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I really want to emphasize why manual exposure is important. And I'm also going to emphasize why auto exposure isn't that great in a number of circumstances. So I'm going to flip over to the Spark video. I'm going to leave it on auto exposure for most of the shooting, and we're going to find out why auto exposure is not such a great idea. So yeah. Let's flip over to the Spark and let's see what happens. Okay, looks like we are rolling. So I've just got the Spark sitting on a tripod right in front of me. I've got my iPhone hooked up to my controller here with an OTG cable, and my phone's in airplane mode. And the reason I'm doing that is I just want to make sure that I'm getting no interference and getting as clean as video as possible. Also got rid of my sweatshirt because sitting in front of this massive tungsten light that's just like right here, way too hot. Should have known that, didn't. So before we really get into it here, I just want to change a few camera settings. So we're just going to go into our camera settings here. I'm going to flip on histogram. That's super important. I'm going to flip on this other thing called display camera OSD. And I'm guessing the OSD stands for on-screen display. Seems a bit redundant, but that's okay. White balance, I already set it to a custom white balance of 3100 Kelvin, and you know, that doesn't actually look too bad. Final thing I want to adjust here, and that's going to sort of show why auto exposure isn't so great in the first place. I'm going to adjust my exposure here because I find it's just a bit too hot. I got this really big glob of bright light on my forehead here, and I think that's just too bright. So what we're going to do is we're going to tap on this thing on the bottom, EV, and what that is exposure compensation. So we're on auto exposure. It's determined, the Spark has determined what it thinks is the correct exposure, and I'm saying, I don't think that's correct, and I wanted to fiddle with that a bit. So I'm just going to dial it down a little bit, and minus 0.7. That's actually probably closer. I know it may look a bit dark, but I think that's closer to accurate. Okay, so yeah, we're ready to get going. Okay, so let's talk about the histogram first. So if you don't know what a histogram is basically, it's a graphical representation of the distribution of tonal values in your image or your scene, whatever your camera is seeing. And on the left side of the histogram, well, that's going to show you all your shadow areas, your dark areas, all the way down to pure black. And the right side of that histogram is going to show you all your brighter areas, your highlights, all the way up to pure white. And then, of course, right in the middle of your histogram, yeah, you probably guessed it, that's going to be all your mid-tone values. So you hear a lot of the times people say, you know, you always want your histogram, you want that nice bell curve right in the middle. Well, in reality, you're going to very rarely see that. I mean, as you can see by the histogram I have on my screen, most of my values are, I have a clump there in midtones, but most of them are darker values. There's a lot of shadow and darker areas in this scene. That doesn't mean it's a bad exposure. There's just a lot of dark areas in this scene. And just like real life, there will always be highlights and midtones and shadow areas in every scene. So it's okay for your histogram to look like something other than that, you know, nice little lump in the middle. The only other thing you want to really pay attention to is you never really want pixels, you know, really jammed up on one end or the other. So if they're all jammed up on the right-hand side, well, chances are you're blowing out your highlights, and there's going to be no detail in those highlights and no way to recover them either. Same goes to the other side, on the left side. If it's all jammed up on that side, well, it's going to be pure black, no detail, and you're not going to be able to recover any detail in post-processing. So my exposure here, you know, maybe it's a touch on the dark side, but I did monkey with it quite a bit today, and I really couldn't get a perfect exposure. Anytime I was playing around with it, I was always getting too many highlights on my head. So I'm just gonna stick with this one for now. Well, now for the fun part. I want to explain to you guys and show you guys how the Spark figures out the correct exposure. And I also want to show you how quickly and easily that system can be fooled. But hey, don't panic. Your Spark camera is not inferior. This is how every single digital camera figures out exposure. They all work the same way, including my big fancy expensive SLR cameras, same way, and they can all be fooled the same way. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate how auto exposure is kind of bad and can be easily fooled, I have a piece of cardboard that has white on one side and black on the other. And I'm going to put it up against, I'm going to put it in front of the camera. And what I want you guys to pay attention to, I want you to pay attention to the on-screen display, and I want you to pay attention to the exposure settings and how they fluctuate when I do that. And also take a look at the histogram and how it changes as well. And I want you to note too that the light in this room is not changing. It hasn't changed like since the very beginning. It is static. So the only thing we're changing is what the camera is seeing. So let's grab the cardboard here, and I'm gonna put up the black side first, and let's see what happens. So right away, you saw how it boosted the ISO, right? Wonder what's going on. Well, maybe I'll tell you. And then we're gonna do the white side now. And you see that it has changed both the ISO and the shutter speed. And you see how our histogram changes as well. Okay, so what was happening there? So when we held up the black card, the metering system is saying, whoa, this scene is way too dark. So it slowed down the shutter to let in more light, and it could also increase the ISO to increase the sensor sensitivity and bring up the exposure as well. And opposite occurred when we introduced the white card. The camera's metering system said, oh my gosh, this scene is way too bright. I have to lower the exposure. So it will speed up the shutter speed to let in less light, and it will lower the sensitivity of the ISO. And that in itself shows you exactly why auto exposure can not be the best choice in a lot of circumstances. So imagine you're out there, you're flying over this beautiful, white snowy field in winter, and it's a beautiful sunny day. Well, your camera metering system is going to read that and say, whoa, this scene is way too bright, and it's going to bring that exposure way down. So what you're going to end up with is kind of a crappy, washed out gray exposure, and you don't want that. And same goes for a darker scene. If you're flying over, a really nice, lush, dark green forest area, your camera metering system is going to interpret that as being very dark, and it's going to want to increase the exposure, and it's going to end up looking just kind of like a pale green and just all washed out, and that's not what you saw, and that's not what you wanted. Okay, so when we have the camera set in auto exposure mode, we only really have one tool at our disposal to counter if the metering system kind of picks an incorrect or bad exposure. And I showed you that at the very beginning, but I'll show you again right now. So go into camera settings, and you see it right there on the bottom. It's the EV, which is exposure compensation value. And I had to dial that down right off the start because I felt that the metering system was making the scene just a bit too bright. So I'm gonna bring back the piece of cardboard again here, and I'm gonna hold up the black one. And you see how it's kind of made that black, maybe a little bit washed out. Well, I can just adjust the exposure compensation value and bring it down maybe a bit further. So our black really does look black. But of course, when I take that away, now our scene is way too dark. So you have to remember that with your exposure compensation value, that it is a relative value to what the metering system has figured out. So what it means is it's always going to fluctuate based on what the metering system is picking up. So let's just dial that back to where it was, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is I want to switch the video over to manual exposure just to really drive home that point that it's just a better choice than using auto. So got to pause the video quickly to do that and unpause, and we are switched over to manual exposure. So I'm just going to go into the camera settings here quickly. I just want to point out one thing in here. So down at the bottom where it used to say EV for exposure compensation value, it's now replaced with MM, and that's just for manual mode. So in manual exposure mode, there is no exposure compensation. We set the exposure to be exactly what we want, and that's what it is. So what that number down there represents, it represents the difference in what we've set for an exposure and what the camera thinks the exposure should be. So what that's telling us is it's saying we're off minus 0.7 from where the metering system thinks it should be. So last test we're going to do here is we're just going to hold up our colored cardboard again and just see what happens to our exposure. So here you go. Here goes the black one, and look at that, nothing happened. And the white one, oh yeah, again, nothing happened. Well, really something happened. The only thing that happened was that little blue exposure value up on our display there, it fluctuated as the scene changed. So basically the metering system is telling us that, you know, the exposure is changing, and here's the difference between what we've set and what the camera thinks it should be. Well, I've got the low battery warning again, so I think it's time to wrap up, but I think that gave you a pretty good example why it's good to choose manual exposure over auto exposure. The camera's metering system can be fooled pretty easily in auto exposure, and that's just going to lead to fluctuations in exposure and color fusing auto white balance, and that's no good. I mean, it makes it a lot more difficult to deal with when you bring it into your editing software and you're trying to, you know, do some post-processing work on it. And I'm sure, as you've seen throughout this video, and when I had it in auto exposure, I mean, things are probably fluctuating a little bit. I noticed just having the Spark sitting on the tripod, the camera would sometimes move slightly, and depending on how it's moving, it's going to interpret the scene differently. It's going to interpret the exposure differently. So it kind of really drove home that point about choosing manual exposure. And, you know, but if you're just kind of starting out and you enjoy flying, you know, auto exposure is great. Most of the time, it's going to do a very good job for you. And, you know, you just kind of fly and you get some great pictures and video, and you don't have to worry about it. But if you do want to take your stuff up to the next level and get the best possible footage you can, well, you're going to want to think about switching things over to manual exposure. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Questions and comments are always welcome. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And yeah, you know the drill. We will see you in the next one.